So this is the third conversation that we're having in our conversation series. Took a little bit of a break because I was on vacation a little bit, but I wanted to bring you guys in to kind of add the voice into the conversation to I would say balance the scales, not balance the scales in the conversations we've had so far, but more in culture, really, to give a perspective from a law enforcement perspective in a lot of the things that are going on in our society today. It's kind of like when I go to the store, I like the thing that's measuring the weight of my fruit to be at 0, and not be weighed down. And we're all weighed down by our own experiences, by our own preferences, by our own leanings, all that stuff. Like, we all come to any conversation with a unique experience that can affect and does affect the way that we interpret things. And so it seems as though in this cultural climate that we're in, the perspective from law enforcement, I haven't personally seen a lot of content out there that gives voice to people who have experience in law enforcement, and that's a world that I have no expertise in. I've listened to like 2 podcasts, and so I'm not an expert by podcast. I don't think that exists, but anyways, so I wanted to bring you guys in. Can you kind of introduce yourselves and kind of give a brief bio of what your experience in law enforcement is or has been? So
we're both going to do the point back and forth. So I've been with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation for 22 years, and all that means is we're the kind of the investigative side of the state police in Iowa. So when you see state troopers riding around in brown uniforms, we are at the same level as they are, only we don't wear uniforms. We wear suits and business clothes and stuff like that, and then we investigate anything that we're tasked with investigating. So my particular assignment within that is I'm assigned to what's called our Major Crimes Unit, and all that means is that we come alongside local law enforcement agencies and assist them with any type of major cases they have. We do a lot of death investigations for smaller agencies, and a large part of what we do with that is we investigate almost all of the officer-involved shootings in the state of Iowa, because we don't work for any local agency, so we're the kind of the objective third party that can come in and review an incident and determine was an appropriate level of force. Did it meet what the United States Supreme Court has said this is a reasonable use of force within that construct. So
you particularly, maybe not exclusively, but officer involved shootings. I mean, that's like to say your bread and butter seems to trivialize it because it's a really serious thing. But you're very acquainted with that world. Interesting. I didn't know that was part of it. That's great.
My name is Jeff Young. I introduced myself.
There you go.
Anyway, my experience has been really started out in the California Department of Corrections, and subsequently moved to parole. I did work probation parole here in Iowa for a few years before going back to California and finishing up my career there as a parole agent and assistant unit supervisor there. So,
gotcha. How many years did you do that?
Total, the parole or the whole thing?
Just the whole thing.
The whole thing, total of about 25 years, 27 years, somewhere in there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man.
So
that's a long time. You don't look old though.
You're holding that well.
I keep the gray off
until you pull your glasses out.
I pull my glasses out. So my experience has been mostly with individuals that have committed a crime and been sentenced to prison. The correctional officer side, and then the parole agent side was individuals after they'd served their sentence. In California, there's a mandatory 3-year parole attached to every parolee. When you get out of prison, you have a 3-year parole period in which to do. You can get released off parole early if you adhere to the guidelines and whatever, but for that, you're going to get basically 3 years of supervision, and for other issues such as sex offenders and stuff like that, it could go out to 5 years or lifetime, depending on the level of crime committed. So.
Gotcha.
So yeah, and so I work different cases. I've had general caseloads. I've had sex offender caseloads where tracking sex offenders on GPS, and our caseloads were roughly about 40 to 1. So I would have 40 different sex offenders that I tracked every month, and and so I had gang member caseloads. So with the majority of my guys were northern. Latino gang members, Northern Structure or Nuestra Familia, or just some of the southern gangs too that moved up north. Few of the street gangs that you hear about, Crips and Bloods and
Sure.
Pyrus and all that kind of stuff. So those were all sprinkled in the caseload. But the area that I was in was for gangs and things like that was predominantly Hispanic. So a lot of history dealing with the gang members and stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
So 20, how many years?
22 in July.
22 and
27.
27. So almost 50 years
Right.
combined of law enforcement experience across a wide spectrum of areas of expertise.
Yep.
Okay. So
and Jeff is he's hitting the tip of the iceberg. We went out to dinner with him and Joe. This was, I think, last summer, and was just mining out some of his experience, particularly in California. And
Dude.
I'm sitting here just going. So he's just giving you a little taste.
Yeah.
Too.
Well,
That's not empty flattery.
That's funny because I had the same feeling because we grabbed lunch maybe
Right.
a month ago, a few weeks ago, something like that. And I walked away thinking the same thing. I'm like, that guy's seen a lot. Like he's seen a lot of different things. So with almost 50 years of law enforcement experience, I think something that would be really helpful, I know for me, and probably for the people who are going to watch or listen to this, is as you scroll through your news feed or watch YouTube or watch the news or whatever, and the headline pops up, okay, white officer kills black unarmed man, right? So and insert the name in there, George Floyd, whatever you want, Michael Brown, irregardless of the name, what's the first thing that goes through your mind as you read that headline? Because it seems as though things are often presented in an inflammatory way, in a way that is meant to stir up emotion. And I think in some ways that's very appropriate. Like people dying, in any sense, is tragic. Death itself is tragic. But from a law enforcement perspective, what initially goes through your mind as you watch maybe mainstream news or scroll through social media and see all these opinions and all these statements and all this stuff in those instances?
Yeah.
I know that's a big question.
Yeah.
It-
You want to step
it's
up to the
case
plate
specific, I'm
first?
sure.
You want me to bat at it, or you step up to the plate, Jeff?
Okay. Well, the first thing that I think about is I need all the information, and typically, whether it's news stations or newspapers or whatever, they make their living off of inciting folks, getting you interested in whatever they're saying. And
Getting clicks.
right.
Gotcha.
And so, if you make your judgment based on seeing a clip of a news station, you're going to be in trouble because you have to look at the whole picture as to what occurred in the whole thing. Now, are there situations where things are done and it's like, wow, you really can't the only thing you can take away from that is a bad situation. However, there are situational things that happen that may cause things to escalate to a point, and at that point, you're talking about split-second decisions that need to be made, and it's just a tough call. And so, whatever the situation, I kind of like to get all the information first before even passing judgment on whether or not that was good or bad. It never ends up good, but, when you're talking about a life being taken.
Right.
But whether things were done appropriately or there's some misconduct.
Yeah, I totally affirm. And again, it's not like an empty affirmation of what Jeff said, but when you ask the question, when you first read that, from a law enforcement perspective, and this has probably just been within the last few years, my head just almost immediately drops because of the headline initially, because there is so much more to the story in just the little snippet of video that we often see. And that question you asked is probably the one that I've even challenged my kids with, is to always go, I need more information before it would be appropriate for me so far away, hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away, to suddenly make a snap judgment on what happened in this particular case, because they're so complex. And I'm sure we'll get into it at some point during the discussion, but there is such a level of, and Jeff described it really well, of split-second decisions. And I don't think that's offered up from an officer's perspective as some type of dramatic thing we have to say or to cast drama in it. It's just what's true when people who do bad things to each other, and you can remove law enforcement from that, when people in general do bad things to each other, you have seconds to determine what's going on. And there's a whole lot that goes in there. So really needing more information. In almost every case, I'm always like, I want to know so much more about this case that I don't think I can get from a 20-second news clip.
Do you think so? Let's take the instance of the day currently is George Floyd, right? And so we watched that clip, and I believe it took some time for those officers to be arrested, right? And there was a lot of outrage over that, because you watch that clip, and man, I have a hard time doing what you said, like going like, I need more information. Like watching that clip, I go, I'm not sure what more information I would need in order to come to a different conclusion as to how horrible that was, And so, can you explain from the law enforcement side why it would take more than like 30 seconds to go to those officers who were involved in that situation and arrest them? Like, what's the rationale behind that?
You bet. I think I'd spin it kind of on its head a little bit. We'll have questions. I use a case study when people will come in, like a student will come in and job shadow with me. And the closest you can get from a job shadow is come in and sit with me for 3 hours, and I'll show you what I do, but then we'll walk through some old case files. And one of the ones we walk through is a homicide where the suspect, or the ultimate defendant, did something horrible to his mom, killed his mom, and then called 911 and said, I did it. And so you could look at that and go, okay, why did you even get called then? You've got him confessing over the phone, right? And you've got her there, so why not just put, guilty on it, send it on its way? And the complexity that goes into particularly an investigation where somebody's life is taken, either a criminal homicide or a justified use of force, or what we saw with George Floyd. Death investigations are just inherently complex because it's not just that snapshot in time of the minutes that the officer got there, but we have to look at what happened before. What led them to be there? The question I always encourage people to ask, and it doesn't mean that it mitigates what the officers did, but the question I always ask is, why were the officers there in the first place? Particularly within the narrative that seems to be being pushed out of white police officers, and I would even pull back police officers and white police officers in general. Now we're to a place where it's just police officers, period, are kind of on the hunt for black men. And so I always go, well, ask the first question of why were the officers there in the first place? And within all of that, there's just a complexity that comes out of that where you're talking about interviewing witnesses and trying to come to a firm understanding of all the facts of the case, so that you can make the right decision. Because if you don't, we shouldn't rush to judgment on anything. And so gathering all those case facts, particularly in a death investigation, they just take time. And it's not, I don't think it's at the expense of anybody trying to drag their feet, but if it was flipped the other direction, society wants us to take our time, even in criminal homicides, where it's the person that calls 911. Those take days and weeks to do. Sometimes there's a quick arrest in 24 hours, but oftentimes you can work a homicide case for months before you actually get and know pretty soon who you think did it, but you have to get to that case where you can do a criminal charge that will then hold up in court. So that just it takes time. So that's part of the equation.
Right, excellent. Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. And the thing I think also, as you said, reports and things like that, an individual was killed, and so there's a medical examiner that's going to determine the cause of death. And so that's not like, hey, just go down and do the paperwork and bring it back and tell us what
That's
the actual
great.
cause of death is. I mean, there's a medical examiner that has to examine a body and come up with the determination as to why that individual died. It's not done overnight. Also, when you think about the district attorney deciding what charges to bring, and if they're going to bring charges, they're not going to bring charges that they may feel, hey, well, this is on a whim, we may win this in court. They don't go to court just to try an individual and see if they can win. It's about this individual we believe committed this crime or broke these laws, and this is what we're going to charge him with. What else goes with that? What else are we going to charge? So I think it gets a lot more complex. There's obviously deals made. The individual may come in and plead guilty to that thing and for a lesser charge, and whether or not the DA wants to go with that or that kind of thing. So there's a lot more that goes into the process. And so you can't just, oh, he did it, we saw the video, go arrest him. It doesn't necessarily work that way.
Sure.
So.
Jeff, can you kind of explain, because you gave a lot of really helpful insight and perspective into, as we were talking over lunch the other day, the thing that was difficult for me, particularly in the George Floyd video, and the way that the news was portraying that was that race immediately got inserted into the conversation,
Right.
where it was as though George Floyd had been killed because he was black,
Right.
because this white guy was racist,
Right.
and you had some helpful things to say, kind of as even you saw that, you processed that, like how do you begin to interpret when race is inserted into these scenarios, while at the same time I have to believe that there are cases where that is the case.
Right.
How do you practice discernment in those kinds of things?
Well, for me, I review or I look at the situation as it's happening. When I see that Floyd situation, I see, I'm going to step out on a limb here a little bit, I see more of an arrogance than I do a racial issue. I see the crowd saying, hey, he can't breathe and whatever, and I see this arrogance in the officer with his hands in his pocket and leaning on this guy. And there's some checks and balances in that. And the hard part for me watching it as a person, and as a person that has been in situations similar to that in law enforcement, to not have the other officers that are standing there say to you, hey man, let me take this. Because it was kind of checks and balances in the different places that I've worked, where if for some reason I was not focused, that somebody else would step in and say, hey, I got this. And then you step back and gain your focus.
Yeah.
So the tough part, and if I could bring in the race issue that comes up for African Americans, is that you say there's one bad officer. If you had 100 officers, and you had one bad officer in there, that doesn't make the whole bunch bad. What African Americans look at is that one officer would do something wrong or similar to the Floyd case in front of the other 99, and nobody will say anything. So they say all officers are bad. You know what I mean? So that's where that's looking at it from the stuff that I hear in the African American community as why there's such a frustration, because they say that one cop is not bad. All of them are, because they stood there and watched him do that and they said nothing. So either they approve of what he was doing, you know, or, you know, they just have no feelings as to who he was doing it to. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
so that's one of the things that makes it a little bit difficult. Again, when I look at a situation like that, I don't see that as being a racial issue. I see the media and all of these things dumping this stuff on top, and I really do think that there's a political agenda that's tied to the situation that has occurred, and you know we won't go into that, but this thing, as far as it being a racial issue, I think it was more of an arrogance than it was anything racial.
So as everything that you just said is super helpful. I was listening to a podcast and I said I was going to recommend it, so I'll recommend it now. It's Malcolm Gladwell. It's Revisionist History, Descend into the Particular, Season 4, Episode 7. One of the things that he talks about in there, and I forget the guy's name that he talks about. It sounds like he has a very similar job to you. And so one of the things he was talking about was the Ferguson case with Michael Brown, where there were actually 2 investigations that came out the same day. One about the particular instance with Michael Brown, and one about the Ferguson Police Department. I think he called it a patterns and practices investigation or something like that. Where the one investigation on the instance with Michael Brown concluded that you would probably know the language better. Basically, that the officer.
It was a justified use of force.
It was a justified use
Yep.
of force. The second investigation into the Ferguson Police Department as a whole, over the course of the next several months, had some level of a conclusion where the police department wasn't acting rightly, in the sense that they were exploiting particular aspects of the community for financial to pad the budget for the city, stuff like that. Where it was almost like if you had 2 sides, both were right, and it depended on which investigation you read, right? Like it was like that instance, justified use of force, but yes, there's a problem here. And these 2 things aren't necessarily connected, but you can see how someone would maybe not respect the authority of the police in light of reading this investigation, while at the same time not going the hands up, don't shoot narrative, like all this stuff where it's like, nah, you got to read this report as well. Like with those 2 things, and again, I'm not doing justice to any of that whole thing, because again, I'm ignorant in a lot of ways, especially compared to you guys. But in light of that, like how do you think through that, where it's like there's instances here where there certainly was justified use of force, as you think through like systemic racism, or at least things that make it look like there might be particular cities with law enforcement that are maybe exploiting particular parts of their communities for financial gain or whatever it is, whatever those reasons are. And that podcast lays out a little bit more. How do you guys think through that, right? And I'm sure it's so case by case. You can't make broad generalizations, but just what are your own thoughts on that from your experience?
Yeah, from the use of force, I guess we'll start with the Michael Brown one. As far as that particular thing, when you talk about a use of force investigation, there's so much that goes into it. And I don't know if we'll get there in this conversation, but one of the things, and within everything that's happened, I would say even it basically started for me back in the Michael Brown, when that started to develop because of the circumstances that were going on, as far as when I can't remember the officer that shot and killed him. It was Darren Wilson. Yeah, thank you. When he decided to use his firearm against Michael Brown, everything that went into that is there is the ability to understand use of force and the physiology behind it and reaction times and things like that is paramount to understanding, is this a justified use of force? And so within applying all the things that we know within the physiology that goes into a use of force interaction, as well as what our Supreme Court has said, this is the template that we're going to use to determine whether or not this was an appropriate use of force. All of those things go into analyzing what happened with Michael Brown, and you can come to a fairly clear conclusion on one sense, like you said. The investigating a systemic issue within a police department is so much more complex, and it wouldn't, I don't know how much it would look like or parallel an investigation, a criminal investigation into a use of force. Because systemic issues, I don't know how you vet out an appropriate, systemic issue that's going on within a particular department, because it's so much more broad than just the police department. You'd have to focus in on the city at large and population densities, and that's not an excuse for being inappropriate with how you handle police and citizen interactions, but there's so much more that goes on from a societal perspective that it feels like, and I know that feelings are often liars, but it feels like from a law enforcement perspective, law enforcement is the easy scapegoat to say, here's where the systemic issue is involved,
right.
when the reality is it's much broader than that. The question that I think we have to ask as a society is, why is it that when a young white boy rides through on a bike in a neighborhood that nobody bats an eye, but a young African-American man rides through on a bike and people take a second look? Those are societal things that we have to tease out and go, why do we do that? Where does that come from? Because within all of that, I think it plugs in the systemic issues that are there. So for me, this one's a lot less clear. The use of force, because of some of the things we have, the physiology, and then just the guidelines we've been given by the Constitution and our Supreme Court, is much clearer for me. And I don't think that's just because that one's way harder to try and discern, so I'm not going to worry about that one.
Sure.
I'm going to stay focused over here. What are your thoughts, Jeff?
Very similar. I think it takes so much more to be able to determine the systemic racism within a department, because now you're talking about looking at every individual person. You're talking about looking at all the records as to how they handle those particular things. You're talking about, again, community. You're talking about the density of population in whatever areas. It's just so much more goes into that than having guidelines. This is what we consider good or righteous shoot or whatever it may be, and was this handled within these guidelines? So, being able to determine a person's heart on the other side as to whether or not there's systemic racism either within a person or whatever. Some you can see by actions. That doesn't tell all the day-to-day interactions that you have with people in the community.
Right.
So that it's a lot tougher to be able to completely nail it down as the systemic racism.
Sure.
And what's often intertwined with that, this was really helpful to hear you say that, Jeff, is that what's often intertwined within that is because of society at large, and particularly poverty, how it influences, particularly in minorities, when you get into impoverished areas, that influences crime. I mean, it just does. Poverty is a huge influence of crime because of you have a nihilism that exists within, I'm just trying to live from day to day, and so oftentimes the value of life goes way down when you're like, I'm just trying to get through to tomorrow, which means if I got to go through you, I'm sorry, dude, it's not personal, it's just business. I'm just trying to get through from one day to the next. Poverty breeds that. Within that, you have a level of crime where there are things that officers need to have, not at their disposal, but there's a lot of training, there's a lot of things that officers need to have to try and prevent crime from happening. Looking at patterns, looking at what are some things that officers can look for to try and prevent crime from happening. And a great example I heard is that one of the I want to say one of the number one things, but a lot of homicides take place in a hand-to-hand interaction on a drug transaction. It's not the guy oftentimes that's driving around. It's hey, I know Jake's got some dope that I want, and I don't have enough money to pay it, and I brought a gun to the fight, and Jake might not have it. So as soon as I do this hand-to-hand where he thinks it's going to be good, I'm going to get there, I'm going to rob him, maybe shoot him, and try and get away. So there's a lot of danger within that. Well, officers will look for activity that looks like hand-to-hand type of activity to try and prevent that, because they know that's a dangerous place. That's where a lot of homicides occur. Well, if they're looking for that in an area that there's just inherently a lot of crime, and they see something that looks like a hand-to-hand, and then they make an approach to try and prevent that, and it happens to have a minority population there, they might not necessarily be there because of the minority. That they're not just grabbing a couple black guys and trying to harass them. They're going off of, hey, this is a hand-to-hand interaction. I want to stop that. And within that, when that doesn't end up being the homicide, or they try it, then it kind of gets pegged. Those types of things are interwoven into what officers are trying to do to prevent crime from happening. And unfortunately, those things get interlaced with, I'm trying to think of the word to kind of describe it in there, where you're like the profiling word gets thrown around a lot. And there is an appropriate profiling and there's an inappropriate profiling. And the reason sometimes it might be one of those things where you go, is it ever appropriate to profile? Well, if a guy's walking up to a bank with a ski mask on and he's got something like this, I would hope that we would give law enforcement the freedom to profile that looks inherently bad. And so within that, there's a lot of things that are intertwined into an investigation of a police department or a law enforcement agency in terms of, is there a systemic issue? I mean, you're peeling back lots and lots and lots of layers and trying to determine what's an appropriate way. Because if we end up being in a construct where we want law enforcement to be strictly reactive, it's just not a good place to be. I mean, you want to. I hope we're always trying to be proactive with preventing things. Because I don't know of a law enforcement officer. I think there's guys that go into law enforcement that are adrenaline junkies. I don't think they last very long, because I think when you see the real deal, you start to realize, I don't need to see this.
Right.
I say all that to say this, and I'll shut up here for a second because I would love Jeff to speak into it too. But when I don't know of a law enforcement officer. I think Jeff and I know between the two of us, we would go, if we were told tomorrow, hey, there's no more crime, you guys can go do something else, we would both go, oh, thank goodness. I would gladly go do that. If my phone never rang for the next 10 years of my life to go work another homicide, I would not bat an eye. I would gladly do something
Your phone
else.
rings a lot.
Yeah, and
It
I
does.
think most...
And not at convenient times.
No, it's
No.
always off time. And I think most law enforcement would say, I wish we weren't needed. I would love it if we weren't.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I don't know, that was a lot to kind of process through.
No, that's interesting that you made that analogy, because I'm a product of that. The eligibility to retire was at age 50, so I turned 50 on a Monday, and that Friday I retired.
No way.
I long for that day, Jeff. I long for it.
So,
Scott's not 50 yet.
so it was like, I've
more
had
years.
enough. I've had enough. Yeah, one of the things that I like that you said definitely about, the challenges of being in the inner city neighborhood, in impoverished neighborhoods. I lived in an impoverished neighborhood, and the sad thing about it is law enforcement, from the time that you're young, probably able to crawl, all that you're hearing about is bad cops, bad cops, bad cops. They're bad, they're bad, they're bad. You don't get a sense of law enforcement is a good thing. Police officers are a good thing. It's always they're harassing people, they're locking this person up, they're doing this. even when the individual's out committing a crime. This guy's out selling heroin in the neighborhood, getting people addicted, you know, tricking girls out, you know, that means sexually abusing them. All of those things are happening in your neighborhood. Your kid could be next that he approaches to sell this to, and police chase this guy down. He fights, does whatever, they get him in handcuffs, and you'll have people on the street screaming, "Let him go, why are you guys treating him like that?" And it's because I think this thing that is built into poor communities is that police hate us, and they're always after us, and they're trying to get us, when that's not the case. Have I, living in those neighborhoods, seen some things that were questionable as an adult now looking back, as far as law enforcement is concerned? Sure, I have. Was it unprovoked in the sense that, hey, just walking down the street, law enforcement came up and grabbed this guy and just threw him on the ground and did whatever? I have not seen, in my experience, a cooperating individual get physically harmed by law enforcement.
I think
It's usually as things blow out of proportion and you get to the resisting and all of those things that start to happen where things go bad. So, right or wrong, as far as the person, in other words, you get pulled over, you don't have a driver's license. Hey, I don't have a driver's license. Hey, we're gonna impound the car. This is your third time. You're going to jail. Hey, all right. Well, I mean, if that was the case, and it was like, okay, I'm going to jail. I know I violated the law. This is what the law says. That's it. Fine. That's what. If it was like that, I don't think you would have all the issues that you have. But a guy gets out of the car, he knows he has no driver's license. There's dope in the car. And instead of taking that, I'm going to fight the officers and take off and run and jump through, backyards and all this stuff and make them chase me. And whether I have a gun or a knife, I'm going to do what, it just gets blown out of proportion. Not from the law enforcement officer's side. He has a job to protect the community. And the majority of the time, that is what is occurring. Again, something that Scott said earlier, was why are they there? Why are you pulled over? Now, even in a law enforcement position, I've been pulled over before. What is it? License plate light was out.
Right.
So, but I cooperated. Okay, yeah, I'd get that fixed, or here's a fix-it ticket. Yeah, okay, well, I'll take care of that.
I think
I didn't get out of the car. I didn't argue. I didn't. There was no big blown out thing. So what I'm trying to say is, and I'm not just speaking for every situation. What I'm speaking to is that, if you do what you're supposed to, if you kind of just do what you're supposed to do, and you don't get disrespectful and you don't do whatever, or you don't escalate a situation. And yes, it's the officer's responsibility to also keep that thing and de-escalate when possible. But things could get blown out of proportion and go so far, so fast, when you have individuals that are unwilling to recognize that, hey, man, I messed up. I did something wrong, and these are the consequences of my actions, as opposed to you're just trying to hold me down. You're trying to keep me from being a human being. So when you talk about the law enforcement side, that part for me, I see it as a crime. If you're committing a crime, understand what's at stake here. And don't be angry or frustrated if you're contacted by law enforcement and they say, hey, you committed a crime, this is what we're going to do. So, yeah, I think I maybe went off the rails on that.
Well,
but-
no,
good.
Scott, you talk about reaction time. It's like that. The thing that I don't take into account, and really honestly understand is the nuances of those interactions and everything that goes into. I mean, like you said, you're talking about reaction time. I mean, you even play that game with your kids where you put your hands, and try to slap it, and
Yeah.
it's amazing. Like, and you do it with adults. I sometimes I'll play that game with Sarah just to make myself feel better about myself, and like, because I'm faster. But it is interesting how it's like if you're the one initiating the action, you're always one step ahead, and it's like milliseconds, and that's what we're talking about here often in these situations, is that these are when we say split second decisions, it's as split second as pull your hands away.
You bet.
It really is that, and so
Your action phrase there is perfect because, and Jeff can probably attest to this, but when you get trained up in defensive tactics within law enforcement, the phrase we hear a lot is action beats reaction every time. And the best analogy of that is just think of any sports analogy. The guy running down the field in the open field, and the kicker is the only thing standing between him and the goal line. The guy running the ball has all the advantage because he knows where he's going. The kicker has no clue. That's why he looks like a Goomba when he thinks he's going
Kind of
this
like a
way.
newborn giraffe out there.
Yeah, running on the Serengeti. And within
that's
that,
a great description of that.
It's-
newborn giraffe.
it's
Come on, you
so
newborn
true.
giraffe.
Yeah, come on, get your legs going. And it's so true because the person dictating what's going to happen next is the person that has the advantage. And so the reason that's so important to understand is that within an officer-citizen reaction, and we'll just use the analogy of the guy that's committing the crime that Jeff talked about, the guy that's selling heroin, and an officer encounters him, and the guy's he's got dope on him, and maybe he's got a firearm with him. That guy, as he's being contacted by law enforcement, has every advantage because in his mind, he can do whatever he wants. He could immediately de-escalate and go, "Yep, you got me. I'm going to take it." He could chirp it up. He could run. He could pull a firearm. And so within that, we have to have, and what's been built into our system is, and by system I'm talking about what the Supreme Court is, the 9 greatest legal minds that we've had in the mid-1980s came up with a case called Graham versus Connor, which kind of laid out, here's how we're going to analyze what's a justified use of force. And within that, they realize that we as society get to look at these issues with kind of a hindsight is 20/20 advantage.
Right.
We can take hours, and as an investigator, Jeff and I, we can take hours and hours to dissect everything that happened. The officer in the moment, he doesn't have that luxury. He's trying to make sure that the public is protected. 2, he's trying to make sure that his buddy is protected. 3, he wants to go home at the end of the night to his wife and his kids, or if it's a female, a husband and kids and things like that. The last one is the bad guy has some attention to it. Now he's lower on the totem pole as far as making sure that things are done safely, but within all of those things, we've realized that you have to give officers, you kind of got to give them that advantage back. And what we do when we do that is we've been told we're going to afford you the opportunity where you don't have to think from a hindsight 20. You don't have to have every detail down. You just have to be reasonable. And where that's important is because that gives an officer a margin of error to make a mistake, not because he's trying to be abusive, but he's trying to be safe. And when you talk about reaction times, I mean, the hand slapping one is great. We did this with my kids a couple weekends ago, my kids and my nephews. Grab one of those Nerf guns that shoots the little golf ball pellet things that, shoots really fast. And there's a guy by the name of Dr. Bill Lewinsky who does use of force studies, I think up in Minnesota or Wisconsin. He does this with actual firearms that have like paint pellets in them.
Okay.
But you can do it with your kids. And simple as this is you have a bad guy and you have an officer. And the bad guy gets to stand with his gun right down at his leg. The officer gets to do the same. And the only instructions are, all right, bad guy, you can choose to shoot the officer whenever you want. But officer, you can't do anything until you watch him go first. And so you watch that play out even with kids, and every time the bad guy's getting his Nerf gun up and and the other one's shooting back and everything like that. Then you take it up a level and you go, all right, this time we're going to give the officer a little bit more of an edge. We're going to let him have his firearm at the ready gun, which means it's out, but it's about here, but it's not pointed, so you're a little bit closer. The reaction time gets a little bit better, but he's still getting shot first most of the time. Maybe they trade off rounds at the same time. And then the last one is you have him go, now you point it square at his chest, right? This is the officer. You point it almost as if you know the guy has a gun, you got to be ready, but you still can't do anything until the bad guy goes first. And maybe you'll get them shooting at the same time, which is not what we want our officers, because then officers become disposable. And I know I've used this phrase in some of our elder team. I don't think we want a society of disposable police officers, because I don't know of anything in my life that's disposable that I value. I don't, you know, when I invite important people over, friends and family, I don't like, I got this amazing disposable coffee cup. I got it for you. And so here's the kicker with all that is the very last one we do is this one. And this is the one that kind of makes you, I don't know, maybe this is too sappy. It makes your heart melt a little bit. I did this with my nephews. As I told the bad guy one, I just pulled him off to the side. And I was like, all right, we've done this 3 times. This time, instead of shooting, I just want you to put your hands up in the air, right? After this has all been built up and everything like that. And every time, even when he's put his hands up in the air, the officer is shot back. And what we're creating in a society right that is that right now, we would look at that and go, that officer murdered that man.
Right.
And from a use of force perspective, we're negating all the other 3 levels that we just went through because of everything that officer is trying to react to in the moment. Is that just because this happened does not necessarily mean that was a homicide, if I'm saying that the right way. And all of those things have to be understood, because if we don't, and if society chooses not, if we move further down the road, which right now we are, is if we're starting to call instances like that homicide, we're at a really untenable place as far as having a sustainable law enforcement capacity. We're building tolerances too tight on law enforcement, where you just humanly cannot expect a human being to be able to react
Absolutely.
with that.
Yeah.
So,
Man, that was like super helpful. One of the things that's been put out there, and honestly, I don't know if it's true or not, is there's like a meme out there where it's like it's got the different amounts of hours it takes to train to be different occupations, you know, and one of the things that it states is that you need more hours of training to be a barber in most states than you do to be a police officer. Okay, one, I don't know if that's true, so clear that up for me, whether that's true or not. And 2, as it relates to training, like what does that look like? Because to be a police officer, to be in law enforcement, with all of those factors, I would really want that person to be well equipped to do that job. One of the things that's swirling around in this conversation is inadequate training. Would you say that there's adequate training for police officers? Would you say that there's not? I mean, clearly we could always use more training. Like, are we in an in-between there? Like, what are your thoughts on the state of training of law enforcement currently?
I'm going back and forth. Keep doing it.
You guys can arm wrestle for it.
Hey, he'd win.
Yeah, you would.
He'd win. He'd jack me up. Yeah, training is it's such a critical piece from this. So I'll speak to that. One of the first things that you asked for. So when I went through, and this was 22 years ago, we went from July until the beginning of November. So I don't know what that is, 4.5 months. And we were at the academy from Monday through Friday. You're there the entire time, and all it is you're being trained up to have the basic police training. And that is everything from motor vehicle law to driving a vehicle, to firearms, to how do you interact, how do you write reports, how do you interact with it. There's so much that goes into it, because law enforcement is so much more than even just the interaction on the side of the road, particularly nowadays within, you are a family counselor, you're a mental health expert, you're an expert on what types of narcotics people, I mean, there's so much more that's going into it. Right now, I think our academy on the Department of Public Safety, I think, is at 22 weeks of training. And that's not just, hey, you're on an online class, you're physically there and they're taking through all those things. After that, you're always having ongoing training, and it differs from department to department as far as how many times a year you train in defensive tactics, firearms, driving, things like that. And then you have ongoing, modules of training, as things start to get discovered, like the excited delirium within, that was something I don't remember coming out when I first came through. I don't know if you remember, but it's something within the last 5-10 years. That's a new thing to discover. And all that is that when people are high on certain types of narcotics, they can get to the place where if you don't respond to them appropriately and put them in a position after they're handcuffed, they could asphyxiate themselves. They could die. And for a long time, law enforcement didn't realize that's what was going on. It was just straight up, oh, this guy died of a drug overdose or it was a heart attack. And so there wasn't a lot of care placed in how do we take care of this person, which is an interesting irony because you're being asked to care for a person who most likely oftentimes has done great violence to somebody else or to you, and then you're expected to turn around and care for them, which it should be that way. Nobody should argue that it shouldn't be that way.
Right, absolutely.
Totally secular, not analogy but line, but from the old movie Roadhouse back in like the 80s or 90s or whatever. You'll have to watch it sometime, Jake.
I was born in 88.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But anyway, you be nice right up to a time where you don't need to be nice anymore.
Yeah, right.
But within that, all of those things that law enforcement is discovering are part of that ongoing training. And how do we respond to people in that way? And it's not a moving target, but you're always learning more about what's going on. Now, is training getting better? I think it is, but there's also a piece to it where everything that's going on right now, I don't think more training is going to fix, because the fix that we're seeing right now isn't within, do officers need to get better? Should those tolerances become tighter? We have a phenomenal misunderstanding as a society on what use of force looks like. And you said something at the very beginning, which is really, it's an ironic thing, is that when an officer takes another person's life in the course of their duties, the courts even realize it's a really ironic thing. It kind of cuts against the grain of what we're asking officers to do. You're like, well, aren't you peace officers? Aren't you supposed to protect people and stuff like that? Well, within that, we recognize that some people are doing bad things to other people, and sometimes their life has to be taken as a result of whatever that is. And it's a really ironic thing. That part is becoming, I think, less understood. And so this isn't an attempt. I don't feel it's an attempt to say, oh no, we're good. We know what we're doing. We don't need more training. Come on, are you serious? It's these things that are happening aren't an area of training. This is because we as society we don't understand what's going on within use of forces or use of force incidents. And there's a gross misunderstanding there's been not a gross misunderstanding. There's been a gross mischaracterization of officer-involved shootings, particularly as it pertains to black men. And so that's the part that I think it's not a training issue, that needs to be understood and identified.
Right.
I don't know. Would you agree, disagree?
Yeah,
And you can feel free to push back too.
Oh,
Jeff,
no,
if you
no,
like that.
no. I do. I definitely agree with that. I think, what was the question again? No.
Yeah. Training, just
Training.
Is it enough?
Yeah, is it a
not
training
enough?
issue?
I got
Is it
so
a training
into
issue?
what you were saying, and my brain started going to other things there that were like, oh, yeah, say this. The training issue, as a parole agent, I went to a 16-week live-in academy. You got to go home on the weekends. We basically went through the laws of arrest and all those different things that are related to. My thing was a little bit different than strictly law enforcement, because not only am I'm responsible for this individual who gets out of prison, who's on parole, and the reintegration of that individual back into society to stop this revolving door recidivism rate. So I'm looking at this individual and I'm trying to protect the public, and I'm trying to get a feel for where this guy is on whether it's drug recovery, gang involvement, where's he gonna live, get him a job, plug him into services. You know, all of these types of things that I have to constantly refer guys to different programs and get them in this and that, whatever, trying to get this guy to change his life. And meanwhile, this individual back into the same community, he is known on the street, he just got out of prison, his homeboys are there, the life is waiting for him that he left, and we're talking about taking that individual and making a new life out of the life that he already has and where he's at.
With like the same ingredients.
With the same ingredients.
Yeah.
You know, I hand you ingredients for a chocolate cake, and I tell you to bake me a strawberry cake. With the same ingredients.
All I've got is chocolate.
Do it.
You
Do
know what
it,
I mean?
man.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
and so
Not a
that
magician.
that was a big. That's what I was kind of tasked with in my thing, and so, you know, the law enforcement side came about as I was, you know, hey, guy's not following these rules. He's giving me dirty drug tests. You know, okay, I'm gonna arrest you for this or whatever, or, you know, whether we get a call from local law enforcement and say, hey, we just got a description of this individual who fits this guy in your caseload. He just robbed somebody here. So now I'm out there and I'm looking for this guy on the street, and he's got a new crime and the whole bit. So there was a lot of different dynamics that went into the way that I had to do this, and so my interaction was not just with him. I needed to know his family. I needed to know his friends. I needed to know his cousins, the individuals that he hung out with, where he went, how he, you know, all of those different things about this guy. Just, that's one person on my caseload. And so with the general caseload, you know, we carried roughly, it was like 99-1 with a general caseload. So you need to know all those different aspects, as opposed to, you know, law enforcement going on the street, you make contact with this guy, if he committed a crime, you know, you arrest this guy, you're not concerned about who his mom is, who his dad is, you know, who his cousins are, all this kind of stuff. How does he tie into the gang situation? How deep does it go in his family? You know, all of those different things. So, so there's a lot of stuff that you really can't get trained for. You know, you can go to an academy and they can tell you, this is how you kind of want to do this. These are the things you need to know. But a lot of that is going to be based on your ability to communicate, your ability to find this information out or talk to people and get them comfortable enough to share with you about their history, about where he's been, where they've been, and all those kinds of things. If you can't build a professional rapport in that aspect with the family, and, you know, that my job would have been, you know, I would not have been able to do it. So training wise, for what we were doing, you know, they gave us the basics, as Scott was saying, report writing, you know, rules and laws of arrest, you know, all of those different things that go in, how to, you know, fill out a warrant, you know, all of those different things. That's the stuff you need, but you're going to cut your teeth when you get on the job. And they stack that caseload in front of you and say, review your files, go meet with these guys, find out who he is, track him in the community, all of those things.
Is there, man, I have to imagine, like, with so much of that being like on the job training, where it's like jazz, it's improvisation, you know, as you're working with the public. Does that look like, are young officers paired with experienced officers in like an apprenticeship kind of thing? Like, is that a thing?
Yeah.
Because I'm like,
They have what's
that
called
seems
a,
like that would make sense, but
yeah. And it's called a field training officer program, or FTO program. And
Okay.
almost across the board in any law enforcement agency within our prison system, things like that, you have an FTO period where an older officer, agent, whatever is you know, taking the new person that's coming out, and that person's usually on a probationary period for roughly a year, and they're walking them through all the nuances of what book looks a lot different, or can look a lot different than what's out in the real world. So that happens, but a lot of time, you know, I was thinking back to what we were talking about in Philippians this morning, that, you know, the life, or not the lifeblood, but the trajectory of a servant or a slave, you know, really depends on who their master is. And I'm not calling an FTO the master, but how that officer ends up it's huge on how is that FTO? Who do they train them? Are they being trained by a Jeff who understands that it's not just running in, go, give me your name, date of birth, and then let's move on. It's building a professional rapport with people. And a lot of times that just comes with years on the job. And guys understanding that, and this is essential for law enforcement, and really good professional police officers get this, is that the other person that you're interacting with is a person just like you are. And that is what we continue to have to push everybody to. You know, Dr. Brian Loritz, I've been spending a lot of time listening to Brian Loritz, Vadi Bochum, Thabiti Anabuele, yeah.
I think I butchered that, but
I know,
it
we
was
probably
close.
both did. Men of God that I highly respect, who recognize that the primary reconciliation we need is between us and Jesus first, us and God first through Jesus. These men, we're going to stand, you know, we're going to sit at the feet of Jesus one day in heaven together. I've just desired to go, help me understand what's framing in where you're coming from. And within all of that, Dr. Brian Loritz said something that was very helpful. There was a lot that I would push back on with him. I'd love to sit around a table like that and dissect this.
I'll call him later.
Yeah,
and
let's
see
do
if we
that.
can. Yep.
Love what he said though, and he has this great phrase, and I will go. I think that's our point that we stay anchored to. He says proximity breeds empathy. And I go, proximity breeds empathy, it breeds understanding. And with all that, I say this, is that when you recognize that the person that you're dealing with in law enforcement, you respond to whatever call, you are just as capable of making that same choice as that person did, given the right set of circumstances. If you realize that is just another image bearer of God sitting across from you, that changes how you respond to them.
That was something really interesting. You said, okay, so from 10 years old until 18, I lived in the inner city and impoverished neighborhood, and we had law enforcement officers who walked a beat in our neighborhood, and we knew them, and they interacted with the kids, and they came and sat next to the guys by the basketball court, and we talked. We'd say we chopped it up. So we sat there and we were chopping it up.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And so we had these conversations, and you got to see them as real people, not just this guy that drives by in his car, chases somebody, arrests them, and whatever. But they walked a beat in our neighborhood, and we knew them, and we would go up and say, hey, what's up, Johnny? You know, O'Brien. It was this one guy that really stood out to me. Big, just buffed out guy, red hair, and his name was O'Brien. And
a lot of Irish background in there, right?
Little Irish
That's
in there,
awesome.
you know. And but I just remember that guy. I remember his face, and I remember him, you know, interacting with him. And I remember them standing there talking with us, twirling their sticks like the old, you know, the guys used to do back in the day when they had the straight batons.
Yep.
And but they were part of the neighborhood in a sense. You know, I don't believe they actually lived there. I didn't know where they lived, but they were interacting with the community. They were out there.
Yeah.
They're present,
And so it kind of made things a little bit different than policing is now. The idea of community policing now is a lot different than it used to be. So I think that adds to the disconnect between law enforcement and inner city people. You know, that you just don't see them that way.
Yeah.
So it's a different take.
That whole proximity breeds empathy thing is huge, you know. And one of the things I'll wrap us up here. We could sit here all night, you know. This has been awesome, but like one of the things, the reason why I wanted to bring you guys here was to bring in proximity some voices of law enforcement, office of people within law enforcement who are solid Christians as well. And so I'm really grateful for you guys and all the years that you served and all the years that you're continuing to serve. You're waiting for 50, man.
I gotta go to 55.
It'll be that.
So
Okay.
I got about 10 left.
It'll be that Monday though that put it in.
Yeah.
But
Oh, yeah.
thank you guys so much for coming
Yeah.
in
Thanks for
and
having us.
adding
This
your
is
voice
good.
to the
Yeah.
conversation. So thanks a ton.
This is good.
Yeah, no, that's, to me, that's where it all begins, is conversation and, you know, the communication where you get to understand the different aspects from both sides, you know, of what's
Absolutely.
going on. And if you get to that, then you can, you know, that's where the empathy comes in.
Yep.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
absolutely. Thanks a
Yeah.
ton, Jeff.
Yeah.
Thanks, Scott.